Okay, so I'm making this video to go over the fairy tale directions to help eliminate tons of questions. I know you might still have some, and that's totally fine. First of all, you get 2 attempts to get the 1. The first draft is due Friday, May 8th, and then I will edit it using the editing key, and you can use those editing key things to complete a final draft, which is due on Wednesday, May 13th. So the directions basically say that you're going to write a fairy tale. And the fairy tale needs to begin with once upon a time, which I wrote here, había una vez. You would just, then after you write that, you would put like your first character. Había una vez una princesa. Once upon a time. And you don't need the word there was, because this is there was at one time a princess. So había una vez una princesa. All right? Fairy tales happen in the past, so the only tense you should use in your fairy tales are the preterite and the imperfect. Except for if it's in quotation marks. If it's in quotation marks, that means somebody's saying something, and you can use whatever tense you need to use there. If after the quotes and you say like so and so said, you need to use the preterite, dijo. Fairy tales have background information. They have descriptions of characters. So at the beginning of the story, you want to make sure you set the scene. Tell us what time period you're in, and where you're at, and what it looks like, what the town looks like. And you want to describe all your characters as they get introduced. So if a new character comes in, you say, oh, this character was so ugly, it had warts, and all of that will be in your rubric. Now, background information, descriptions of characters, of course, is in the imperfect because you're giving background information. Fairy tales, they usually have make-believe, fantasy, a good and a bad character. You can use things like magic, giants, elves, witches, or fairies. All those words can be looked up on wordreference.com. That's my favorite online dictionary, wordreference.com. My favorite online conjugation tool, if you're struggling with how to conjugate a word in the preterite or the imperfect, would be Spanish dictionary. That is a great one for conjugation help, okay? Fairy tales have a problem in it, so you're going to need to have a problem, and the ending should solve it. Now, I put it should have a happy ending, but I've found over the years people interpret a happy ending differently, and I'm totally fine with that. Like, if it's happy to you because the bad guy gets thrown off a cliff, whatever, okay? Now, here's some requirements. You have to have a cover page. Your cover page needs to have a creative and interesting title and needs to have your name. Whenever you're writing that it's by something, you're going to use por, like por Juan, written by Juan. You should have an illustration on each page. In a minute here, I'm going to show you a few examples from the past. I'm not saying they're the greatest examples from the past, just the ones that I was able to find quickly on my computer. You should have at least 10 pages, including the title page. But remember, you have a complete story to tell. You have a complete story to tell that has to have a plot, a resolution, background information, and character description. So it's definitely not limited to 10 pages. That's what it has to have at least. It needs to have at least 15 vocab words from your list. There's words like flood, bomb, etc. Those last 2 lists are the lists that you're allowed to use on this, the last 2 lists that you got. I think that covers the main directions. Make sure you underline those vocab words, but the rubric really also helps. Hopefully I have the rubric pulled up here. Aha, here's a rubric. Okay, so I'm gonna just mainly focus on how to get a 1, and which is a 4 on the rubric, but so the cover paper and the length, the cover has an interesting Spanish title, has an illustration and the author's name. It has your whole thing needs to be at least 10 slides in length. It's done on Google Slide. There's an image on every slide. Characters and setting. All of the characters in the story are described thoroughly with background information, personality, and physical characteristics. All the different settings are described with lots of details. It goes above and beyond with scene setting and character description. Plenty of characters to have as a complete story. Now, remember, the better you do now, the better next year, because I'm going to assign this straight away at the beginning of the year next year, and we're going to go through your old ones and figure out how to make them up to our standards. So at the very beginning of the year, we're going to start in Spanish 4. We're going to start right away with preterite versus imperfect, and we're going to go more in depth into how to use it in the real life. And we're going to read a few books at the beginning of the year, and we're going to fix up these fairy tales. The plot, the story is a fairy tale. There's an ample plot with plenty of detail. The problem is described and the solution makes sense. There's plenty of story development that none of the elements seem abrupt, and it's well organized. So sometimes people get tired of writing, and so they don't thoroughly go through the problem or the resolution. You want to make sure that you have a well thought out problem and a well thought out resolution is basically what that says. Vocab and grammar. A student has 15 underlined vocabulary words, only a few small grammar errors that interfere. And of course, the last category is product versus imperfect. So student makes no errors when choosing between the product versus imperfect. Now, obviously, to get a 0.5, doesn't have to be perfection. To get a 1, it doesn't have to be perfection on the second draft. But on the first draft, most of you will get 0.5 because I doubt any of you are going to submit a perfect one. And then I'm going to let you use my my editing key comments to better it. And as long as you do the best you can at bettering it, you're probably going to get a 1. As far as fixing those errors. Now, if you don't use my editing key and fix errors, then I'll just leave it at a 0.5. But that's basically how that goes. And then, of course, some examples. So this one was done last year. Just an example of how you can look how beautiful this, I think it's a beautiful fairy tale. This was her final copy, so she has a few things still. You can see that's me putting it in the highlighted pink, making mistakes, but very few mistakes at the end of it by using my examples. And you see how she has an image on every slide. Okay, let's look at another one. This is another one. This student took faces and put them over her characters. I thought, that's pretty creative. Takes a lot of effort. Obviously, you're not going to have access to people or pictures, probably, so you're going to have more trouble getting creative with it. That's okay. Just a simple putting in images, putting little text bubbles like that. Those are all just fine. So those are some examples of how it will look in the end. Okay, if you have questions, please email me or send me a remind. This is it. This is your last project, and I can't wait to actually see you guys next year because teaching Spanish online has not been my idea of fun.